Well, who I am today, I'm still a father. I'm still a husband. I'm always an agitator.
Ooh,
And
agitator.
yes, and I try and do it with some degree of humility. But that's hard because you go through these stages when you're not who you want to be and the church isn't what it needs to be. And so I think holy agitation is important to this work. I am repatriating myself. Yeah, I've been in white evangelical spaces for a long time, where I had to give up the essence of my own humanity, steeped in a rich Black tradition from South Central LA, to then sort of getting baptized into evangelicalism and trying to wrestle through what does it mean to be my authentic self and navigate these systems that aren't designed for the communities that I serve.
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest.
Well, welcome back to the Upper Left show, brought to you by Multiply PDX. My name is Gabe Kolstad from Westside Community Church out on the west side, and I'm joined by the infamous Oshua Hawthorne from Brilliance Labs. I mean, this guy's been my sidekick here, and I've been his sidekick in this show. We're excited about today's episode. Is going to be super fun because we get to meet a gentleman named Eric Knox, who I have been told by so many people that I should get coffee with, and so we're doing virtual coffee today with Eric Knox. Lots to learn, lots to hear about. But hi, Eric, how you doing?
Good, Gabe. How you doing, man?
Awesome. It's so good to see you and to meet you.
Likewise.
And Asha, I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, man. Stoked. And if you're talking infamy, that's Eric Knox himself.
Oh, okay.
Oh my word.
All right.
I hope that's a good thing. I hope that's a good thing.
Oh yeah. You're going to be in the Portland Church Planners Hall of Fame whenever they get around to setting that up.
Oh wow.
You're in that thing.
Well, let's find out a little bit about why. So, Eric, why don't you introduce us to yourself? Who are you?
Well, who I am today, I'm still a father. I'm still a husband. I'm always an agitator.
Ooh,
and
agitator.
Yes. And I try and do it with some degree of humility. But that's hard because you go through these stages, when you're not who you want to be and the church isn't what it needs to be. And so I think holy agitation is important to this work. I am repatriating myself. Yeah, I've been in white evangelical spaces for a long time, where I had to give up the essence of my own humanity, steeped in a rich Black tradition from South Central LA, to then sort of getting baptized into evangelicalism and trying to wrestle through what does it mean to be my authentic self and navigate these systems that aren't designed for the communities that I serve.
Wow. That was so much in so little words. Did you say holy agitation?
I try. Sometimes it ain't holy.
I love that. That is just a beautiful two words put together. My goodness. And then you said you're repatriating yourself.
Yeah.
That's a neat way to describe what you just said. That's so cool.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, would you share a little bit about, your background then? What's led up to all? What's your background serving in church ministry in the Portland area?
Man, I got saved in 19 in Corvallis, in a small college town by a pastor that was white from Mississippi, and they wore a bow tie. Not a bow tie, but a bolo tie.
A bolo tie.
Yes, and cowboy boots. So you can imagine, I get saved at 19. I'm in Corvallis at Oregon State, and I have a spiritual epiphany and encounter Christ, but I have no place to go that represents me, right, culturally. So I'm in this church, and I'm thankful for that church because it was everything that I wasn't, and it created, I think, the platform for what I do today. You know what I mean? Which is crossing so many different intersectionalities between church and culture, between race and And, that's pretty much what it's been for me. Just like all these different types of intersectionality that it created, but it started back in Corvallis. So
that's cool. And then you've been involved in church ministry in the Portland area for some time. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been in church. Yeah. I've been a part of a lot of different churches, but I planted the Well Church. I planted the Imago Dei East Side. I went to Los Angeles and planted a church called Sojourn Village. I was over a network called Waterhouse, which was a church planting network.
Yeah.
So, I'm no stranger to church planting.
Totally. And Waterhouse was birthed at Imago Dei, right?
It was.
Rick McKinley.
Yeah, Rick McKinley.
Okay.
And, it was a desire to bring like-minded people that were living in mission together to plant and support each other. And it was a real neat concept that we got off the ground.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Ash, you want to dive into some of the deeper questions with us?
Wow. Yeah. Well, we can go into the deep side of the pool pretty quick. So you mentioned some of the challenges of being in largely white spaces within the evangelical church. And we're eventually going to get to your current ministries and how you're serving more in the public space. But I'm curious if you're willing to share what some of those challenges were in church ministry, whether directly related to some of the cultural challenges or just in general, your heart to impact the city. What was challenging about church-based ministry for you?
Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., that is, talked about the beloved community, right? And this sense of wanting to be seen and known and know others. And I realized being in white spaces, particularly as an athlete, but just being Black in general, that when you enter sometimes in these Black or white spaces, I realized early on that I was acceptable but not accepted, right? Like as long as I talked the language, as long as I believed in the creed, as long as I kind of expressed or didn't push the cultural boat of the evangelical system, I was, there was a lot of opportunity, a lot of doors open. But the moment I tried to live deeper into who I was culturally, I found a lot of pushback. And then I realized that once I stepped out of that, the phone calls stopped happening, the platforming went away, the relationships withered. And then I came to the conclusion that I wasn't ever accepted in those spaces. I was just acceptable. I was an acceptable Black man that played a particular role in those spaces that reinforced their status quo. So it was an extremely hard thing for me to navigate, but you only know what you know. I was frustrated, but I didn't have the theological understanding of why I was frustrated. I got that later on, and it started to make sense. And then I went through all my stages of grief, and came out on the other side a much healthier person. I think about Jesus, right? I was just talking to somebody on a walk this morning. I was like thinking about like when the woman broke an alabaster box of perfume on his feet, and the religious folks, which was the religious establishment, did not get what he was doing or get what she was doing. And then Jesus understood that this was preparation for his burial. And then you just keep going into the gospel and you see how Jesus was being prepared for his burial, which was ultimately death. And then the resurrection on the other side of that. I just think about all the pain that I experienced in white evangelical spaces was preparing me for my own death to resurrect into something brand new. And it's actually the work that I do today. And coming back on the other side, looking at the evangelical church from a healthier perspective and appreciating some of the things that I took out of it, but being honest about all that comes with it. So
wow.
I don't know if any of that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it does. Now, would you feel like somebody comes to mind as Shai Linne's story? I don't know if you're familiar with his book. And he talks about his history in hip hop, but then getting discipled within a white, more reformed church, and kind of you could say the love-hate relationship that grew between the white Reformed community and the black Christian hip hop community, and that whole movement and history there. I'm curious, would you describe like your current ministry more outside the church and outside of evangelical white spaces? Do you feel more of it? Is it more of a dropout, or is it more of a launching? Like, is there, what does that relationship look like now as you still engage in the city of Portland?
Well, I was the product of a lot of people, regardless of race, in terms of sort of what, I mean, you can call it deconstruction or whatever, but, you know, in the pandemic, churches shut down and it gave a lot of us opportunity to stop and think and reflect. And I don't think we do a lot of critical thinking. So the pandemic gave me a lot of time to critically think about my evangelical experience. And when the pandemic, you know, when things opened up and people were going back to church, I realized that I didn't need that anymore. That, you know, I think I hung in there because there was a certain degree of protection and opportunity. I'm a man. There's a certain degree of privilege in evangelical spaces, right? I'm the lone black guy. So you know, there's sort of this voyeuristic relationship that I found people had with me and people of color in those spaces, right? And so there's a benefit to that. And then once I realized, and a safety. And so once I realized after the pandemic that I didn't need that anymore, that I could step out like Peter onto the ocean and trust God and believe him to, you know, give me a completely different experience. It was powerful. And so when we talk about launching, yeah, it launched me into the work that I do today. And I feel like I'm living my dream because I'm still plugged into a church and I'm plugged into the community. But I always felt like the church and the community well, at least the community I was serving didn't understand each other. It's like when I was at Waterhouse, to be honest with you, so much so that, you know, I was running the network and I got at least 20 different calls, 20 to 25 different coffees of guys coming to the city, wanting to plant a church. And ironically, every one of them felt called to plant on the west side, right? Nobody wanted to come to the east side because they didn't understand. They didn't have a theology, a context, anything to know how to serve and show up in these spaces. I felt like, man, I have the privilege and honor now because of my experience to kind of put these two things together, right? And so I feel like I've got my feet in both worlds.
Hey, I just love, Eric, the way you describe things. It's rich and it's deep. And I also just want to pause and say thank you for your courage. I mean, the way you talk right now, I'm sure that you represent so many other people's journeys just in the way that you're describing this. So thank you for that. And
thank you, man.
I also can I poke on one thing you said a couple minutes ago?
Yeah.
When you said you kind of were bumping into, every time you would try to express your authentic self, you'd bump into resistance, basically, right?
Yeah.
Do you mind sharing, like, what expressions are you talking about that created that? Do you mind jumping into that for a second?
Yeah. I mean, real simple one, just experience. Like, so much of spiritual formation in white church is in your head.
Yeah.
Right. And I come from a people that were enslaved, that were oppressed, pushed to the margins, right? Didn't have the Bible, right? We're told what to read and what not to read in the Bible. And there's a history that comes with that. So a lot of our folks were steeped out of their encounter with God, right? Their experience of God. I have found in those white evangelical spaces, a lot of that was not honored at all. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Like, cause we're heavy into science, apologetics, stuff like that to prove God. Black spaces, brown spaces don't prove God that way, right? They prove God through suffering. Look at all that our ancestors went through, and yet we trusted God. And there's an apologetic to that. That kind of stuff is not honored, right? Because white folks have a fundamentally different understanding of what suffering is. Like today, you know, they think prayer getting taken out of schools is suffering, right?
We got first world problems.
Yeah, they're first world problems. And so I just found operating in those space, the way we work, the way we schedule. Like I always scheduled like 2-3 hours of every day. I always kept open to be available for somebody to connect with me at a moment's notice. Right? I felt like if I wasn't scheduled and looking busy in white evangelical spaces, I wasn't being productive.
Wow.
And that was a lot of BS that I encountered. So, you know, I had a different rhythm of working that wasn't seen, that wasn't appreciated or valued. And so so the moment I created HOLLA and HOLLA School, I wanted to make sure that I was building an organization that was congruent with how we live our lives as Black and brown folks, right? So, I mean, I could go on and on of different ways that I felt not seen and not honored. The way we budgeted, like I remember I'm not going to name churches, but I was a part of a church and I asked them, let's look at the budget and think about how money is purposed toward different communities. And I was shut down. They didn't want to hear that. Right. And so, again, that made me feel unseen, made my community feel unseen. And so those were some of the experiences that I had.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
Wow. So let's talk about now that those new roles that you have
Yes.
created for yourself and for the kingdom. And I wonder, even as you're sharing about some of the disillusionment and frustrations in church spaces, I think a lot of people deal with that, right? And there's the whole deconstruction movement, but a lot of folks, they just drop off the map and they take it all the way of like, okay, well, the bride is messed up. So then the problem must be with Jesus and must be with the scriptures themselves. And so I know you've taken a different path. You've disconnected from your vocational calling within the church sphere, but you're now serving Jesus more in the public spaces instead of just dropping off the map. So talk about that. Tell us about your last couple projects that you've started and what you see God doing.
Hey, man, when Jesus said that, what is it? The birds have nests and such has whatever, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. I forget how it goes, something like that. That's how I feel, right? Because I got over into these other spaces, operating in these school systems, and I mean, what people would deem as sort of left leaning. And I realized soon enough that what I left, I came to in these other spaces because they have an orthodoxy as well. And there's much to critique there. You know what I'm saying? And so I didn't kind of fit in any of those spaces. So I wanted, I wanted to be more self-determining in my work. I didn't want to eat off the what I call white evangelical conscience, because there are folks that are folks of color in those spaces that are pushing the church and, making a living doing that stuff. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to eat off the evangelical church. I didn't want to have to, go raise funds, but I have to prove to them that so many people got saved or baptized or coming to church or any of that stuff, right? I just want to show up and figure out what does it mean to be a witness now. And I'm still on that journey. So, being in the space, we created HOLLA. It was a leap of faith. We created, subsequently a school, which was another leap of faith. And, we just wanted to do it our way. And so we're doing a culturally specific mentoring organization that is about matching Black and brown kids with Black and brown working professional and adults. And then on the school side, creating an academic pedagogical ed model that focuses and highlights on the ABCs in our community for our kids, which is, we believe every kid is abundant. We believe every kid is brilliant. We believe every kid is creative. And we want to put Black and brown folks in front of them that embody all their ways of being in the world. So we create windows on the one hand and mirrors on the other. Windows meaning we want them to see out into the world, the possibilities, and create access for that to get them exposed. Window is we want to mirror back to them adults, working professionals that look like them so that they understand that they can be whatever they want to be. Because we believe fundamentally at the end of the day, you can't be what you haven't seen. So to see a black man show up as a teacher in your class and give you a portrait of what you can be, you can't qualify that. You can't put money on that, right? It's priceless. So that's a mouthful, but that's kind of how my work has kind of come together.
Holy smokes. I am going to go back through this with a pen and a piece of paper because the stuff that you just said is so good, Eric. Thank you. That I love
Thank you.
the direction that you're headed with this.
Thank you.
Wow. So let's tease out a little bit more, maybe on the macro level. You step back, and if we have folks that are, maybe they're thinking about church planting, they're thinking about having an impact on the city of Portland. And often within the church route, we think, hey, we're going to proclaim the gospel. We're going to host Sunday services, and maybe we're going to do some outreaches, right? And that has an important role, and the kingdom's plodding along through the church doing that kind of ministry. Now, you just hop spaces. You're like, no, I'm gonna jump into the public school system. No, I'm gonna jump into the more, you could say, secular NGO world, and we're gonna run in those spaces. Now, how do you think about city and cultural transformation, and what role do people like you that are like jumping into the deep end of, as honestly as people view Portland, at least from the outside, and some of us for the inside, is like, dude, this is a really dark place, and there's a lot of resistance to gospel ministry. But you jumped into the deep end, and you're engaging there. What does that look like, and how does that accomplish change for the city?
A couple of things. First, I think if you come into the city to try and transform it, you're coming with the wrong intentions. Because if you come into the city with the ideal that I'm going to change it, you're going to be deeply disappointed. I think you need to come into the city asking yourself, how does the city change me? How does it critique my biases, my prejudices, my assumptions about people? I love, like, when you read the Gospels, I mean, the most important thing that Jesus did was challenge the purity codes of the Jewish religious leaders. They couldn't stand it because it was about who was in and who was out. And Jesus widened the circle. You talk about the kingdom of God widens the circle about who gets included, right? But you can't include others if you're not critiquing your own biases and boxes that you live in. It's called, like they call the coloniality matrix, where you diagram this box and you say, who gets to be in this box and who's out of this box and why? And a lot of times we create those philosophical, theological boxes because there's a degree of safety in that. I don't subscribe to certainty. I'm about mystery, curiosity. And when you come into the city with curiosity, it's going to critique everything you'll fundamentally understand about your humanity and subsequently everybody else's humanity. The other piece is, if you ever read Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, man, I love his language around with, not for. Like, we don't work for a community, we work with the community, right? And that is something that I've always been passionate about is, look, man, I'm in this community, not transforming it, but being co-transformed, doing the work together with the folks that I get to serve and are being served by. I think sometimes the church suffers from omniscience, meaning they think they're all knowing and they pretend to know the needs of what the community. I don't. I let the community describe. The school came because this is what this community wanted. Mentorship happened because this is what the community wanted. I didn't come in saying we're going to go in here and start a clothes basket or I don't know, a sex trafficking work. That's not what we did. We came in, spent 6 months getting to know the community, and the community told us what they wanted to see happen, and we resourced it, and we will continue to do that. So I think those are the like two essential things. If you want to be in this work of transformation, realize that, like, your omniscience is not going to work. Your omnipresence isn't going to work, meaning like white supremacy is real. How you show up in these spaces are important. You need to think and examine that, right? And how it impacts the community that you want to serve. Omnipotence is real. Like when a church thinks that it's all powerful, can come into a community and hold its pain It's nonsense, and change it. And you know what I'm saying? And some of them even merchandise it. I remember a church, very big church. They went to Roosevelt High School. They pumped a bunch of money at the school, and then a year later, they were doing a documentary, like almost like a Netflix documentary about what they assumed they did in that community. And it was such a counterintuitive way to come to a community and try and change it. So that's how I think about it. It's slow, it's deliberate. We move at the speed of trust. You know what I mean? And trust is essential to engage in these communities. A lot of people have no clue about the relational language of trust. So they just move fast into the community because, right? Like there's dollars attached to that. There's recognition attached to that. There's platforming attached to that. There's books attached to that. I don't subscribe to any of that stuff. To me, it's about critical connection, not critical mass, right? And those are, we draw circles of collaboration and not lines, right? So, again, that's like, I'm giving y'all a lot, but this is sort of how I think about the work.
It reminds me of something that Francis Schaeffer once said, where he said, if I have an hour with someone to share the gospel with them, he says, I'm going to listen for about 55 minutes and I'm going to get to know them. I'm going to ask them questions. I'm going to hear where they're at so that in the 5 minutes that I'm sharing the message of hope, I know how to actually apply it to their life. And it sounds like that's what you're doing through lived, integrated experience and service and listening in this community.
I think one of the gifts for all of us in COVID, not just the time to reflect and do some critical thinking, but also just to have our power stripped away, was so good for all of us. Because I think no matter what church setting you're in, you are much more aware of your limitations now than you were 5 years ago.
Yeah.
If you're doing church ministry in the Portland area at all.
Yes.
And I think it made us all want to ask some of those questions.
Yeah.
You're putting language to some stuff that we can carry forward, I think, in that.
Yeah. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, Eric, what would you say to the person that hears you, but then says, but I'm worried about being conformed to culture, right? I'm worried about, hey, if I enter these spaces and I spend all this time letting it change me, then I'm going to come out less of a Christian or more like maybe certain of the more secular, materialistic, pluralistic structures and viewpoints within the culture. Like, how do you keep yourself grounded in the Word when you're around communities of folks that are directly, and you could say, opposed to certain things that the Scriptures teach?
I think the worst thing that happened to Christianity is trying to be countercultural.
Okay.
I do. I think they didn't think Jesus was a good Christian, right? Think about his associations, man. They thought he was too secular to be our messianic hope, right? And I think if you're in that space, they're going to, that's the risk. I think of Galatians, and I think Galatians 4, Paul said, become like me because I became like you. And his whole argument is the gospel, right? Justification by faith, that we're not saved but through our works. And so he says, I became like you, so become like me. Now, we understand most of the churches that preach oftentimes come into a community and they're all about the community becoming like them. That's their preaching. Become like me. Become like us. Become, you know what I mean? Have your family, your business, your spiritual formation, your culture, like us. That was me as a Black man. Like, I went into churches where I had to become like them. Paul said, become like me. Why? Because I became like you. Right? And so he took on the pain, the suffering, the struggle of that culture. And through that, deepened his witness in that Galatian community. Now, with that being said, when he said, um, become like me because I became like you. Remember, he's arguing for the gospel. And in Galatians chapter 1, he says, if anyone abandons this gospel, may they be accursed. So he's unbendable about what the gospel is. But culture is fluid. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's why Jesus was breaking purity codes, because they had a clear definition of what it meant to be a Christian. And that's, like that whole question about, I don't want to not be a Christian. What does a Christian look like? We know what Muslims look like. We know what Hindus look like. But what does it mean to look like a Christian? That's the beauty of Christianity, that it looks like a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so, that's why sort of being this counterculture creates this sort of notion of what we assume a Christian needs to be or look like or think like, and oftentimes it's whoever holds power, right? And most of that is, cisgendered, bodied, able white men at the end of the day, because they have the power to change the narrative. But like that African proverb says, until a lion gets a historian, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter. Right? And so, like Christianity, so much in the West and our first century, our white Eurocentric Western culture, most of the story of what Christianity is told by white men. I'm here trying to tell a lion's perspective, right? I'm trying to explain the lion's Christianity, what that looks like, right? The hunter always says the lion's perspective is too secular, too worldly, too whatever. Paul said, nah, man, like I became like you, become like me. Like I can become like a lot of things because Christianity isn't crystallized into any kind of cultural expression. Does that make sense? Or was that just
man?
This makes good sense. I'm kind of curious what your dream would be for the church in Portland. And I'm using the word church as loosely as you can. But given your perspective, I mean, I know why Oshua invited you on here with us is because he knew you have a unique lens for ministry, for transformation. And so what do you think would be awesome in 10 years, 20 years to see in our city?
Man, I tell you, man, I would love to see the church read a lot of Henry Nouwen. I would. Henry Nouwen tackled the subject of leadership. And I think if the church leaders embraced this, man, our churches would be different. And he goes into this scene about Jesus and the three temptations, right? Jesus, right after he'd come out of the wilderness, and, he takes him up to the steeple, says, throw yourself off. And then the other one, what was the other one? Making
the bread in the wilderness and
yes. And what was the third one? One of those. But he camps on to he says, Satan tells him, turn this stone into bread.
Yeah.
And he goes into this whole ideal about relevancy. And he said, man, if Jesus would have turned that stone into bread, imagine how relevant he would have been to the first century Palestinian culture. How do we make ourselves not relevant? Right? To me, that's my vision. Like, that's my heart, right? Like it's like when he wrote Clowning in Rome, you didn't recognize clowns in Rome, but how pivotal a role they played in the experience of Rome. I would love the church to be those clowns in Portland, right? That work toward irrelevancy, right? That serve from the bottom, not the top. Oftentimes our hermeneutic is so flawed because, it's a hermeneutic of empire, right? It's a hermeneutic of dominance, and steeped in that is competition and all that other stuff, platforming, celebrity pastoring, all that stuff. And Jesus and the kingdom was completely different. Right? It was on the edges. It was on the margins, amongst the poor, amongst the peasants, right? It was a critique not only of the system, but of Caesar himself. And so when I think about what I love this church to be, I love to exercise a high degree of humility and work from the bottom, right? To identify with the people Jesus identified with, the poor, the oppressed, the marginalized. But the problem is most of our theology reinforces status quo. So we can't engage these other cultures and these issues because they have been so politicized now.
That's powerful. So you're saying being relevant isn't just about having fancy lights and fancy bands and charismatic TED Talks, right? You're saying there's something deeper going on.
Yes, there's something deeper going on, man. This church is sick, man. We're sick, and all of us are complicit in it.
Yeah.
Like I'm not wagging my finger at the church and saying they are. I am, right? You can't be in that space for as long as you've been in that space and not feel like you've been contaminated by it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, it makes me wonder, like, any contamination in the church is because of the cultural soil that we live in and because of the sin that each of us bring into the church community.
Yes.
Right. And so it's that, we need God's mercy and kindness to transform us. I wonder, so as you said, you're speaking to your own heart. What encouragement or exhortation do you have for yourself and for other church leaders, or maybe even like new church planners that are coming into the city? What words would you say as you look at your time in the church, your time in more the public spaces?
Yeah. Yeah. So I spent most of probably the last 20 years, I would say, wrestling with what the gospel is and understanding what grace is, because so much of our theology ends up in shame, right? And so not being hard on yourself, because, this stuff that I'm talking about, it's like drinking out of a fire hydrant. It's just a lot. And you don't get there all at once and you never arrive. There is never there, right? You just on this journey, and you're getting one bread morsel to another bread morsel until this stuff starts to make sense. That's why Jesus said the kingdom of God is like. He didn't say the kingdom of God is, because you can't wrap your arm around it. It isn't like, it's like a lot of different things, right? So I guess what I would say is don't be hard on yourself. I spent 20 years in grace. I'm telling you, this stuff my critique of the church would have been ugly if I hadn't spent 20 years understanding grace. I spent a lot of time. Actually, one of the things that I do appreciate about Tim Keller, right? I am not Reformed. I'm not a Calvinist. I'm not an Arminian. I'm not any of those things. But one thing I can appreciate about from Tim Keller is that piece of the gospel of grace that has been super helpful and useful for me today in handling people that aren't where I'm at, thinking deeply about this stuff. And so it takes time. Be gracious, be kind to yourself, be curious and not certain. Be mysterious, value mystery, and critique your own assumptions. Sit in them. If you don't understand them, sit in them and let it pass through you. That's what I've been able to do. My patriarchy, and that's been huge for me. So,
wow, I feel like we went to school today for a little bit.
Man,
seriously, wow! Thank you so much,
man. I just appreciate you guys having me on the show. I will also add, read authors that aren't white. All of my seminary were mostly dead white men. And that's pretty much who did most of their deep thinking, not in community. Right. And, I read it all. I read Native American theology. I read Hispanic theology, Latin American theology. I read Black liberation theology. I read feminist theology. I read it all. I don't agree with it all, but I read it all, and it shapes me. Right?
Yeah.
Like this first world Eurocentric perspective that I got theologically is not healthy, and it's theology amongst many theology, right? But when you talk about James Cone, we call it Black theology. If we talk about this Latin American theologian, we call it Latin American theology. When we talk about John Piper, we call it theology.
Just theology.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good indictment.
Like it ain't white theology. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So Eric, give our listeners a handoff. Where can they find you? Where can they support what you're doing and follow your work?
You could never find me. You could never find me. I'm hard. I'm elusive. No, you can find me. Just go on hollamentors.org or hollaschool.org, and there's a link there that if you want to connect with me, you just click the link and we'll figure out how to connect, right? Or check us out you can check me out, EJ _ Knox on Instagram, or HOLLA School, or HOLLA Mentors on Instagram. There's lots of ways you can find me or us.
Awesome.
Well, I don't want this to end. maybe to be continued.
To be continued.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.